All right, I'm going to read Schaeffer's motion60b. In some emails that he sent me, he indicates this is incredibly important. I've also uploaded it to Schaeffer's Dropbox, and underneath his Dropbox folder, I created another subfolder called motion60b. This is 26 pages, but I think when it was scanned into this PDF file, there's multiple pages on one page, so it's more than 26 pages. But I got this from Maria, and I'll just start reading it. And Schaeffer's wishes were that this absolutely be published as widely as possible. Page 1. Misconduct by Alaska prosecutors worse than previously believed. Newfound evidence suggests a D.C. court is being asked to reopen an investigation of the Alaskan prosecutors responsible for the botched case against longtime Alaska Senator Ted Stevens after evidence of continued misconduct services, including use of FBI agents to sabotage Joe Miller's Senate campaign and jail grassroots organizers. Contact Maria Patricia or Robert John. Robert John's phone number is 907-456-6056. The second page is completely empty. The next page is Francis Schaeffer Cox, registration number 16179-006, USP Marion, P.O. Box 1000, Marion, Illinois 62959, May the 22nd, 2014. Honorable Clerk of Court, United States District Court for the District of Columbia, 333 Constitution Avenue Northwest, Pretty Man Book Building, Room 1225, Washington, D.C. 20001. Related Special Proceedings, Miscellaneous Number 9-0198 EGS. Dear Clerk of Court, please find enclosed an original of my motion for access to report to the Honorable Emmett G. Sullivan of investigation pursuant to the court's April 7, 2009 order, and or interested/affected and injured non-party petitioners motion to reopen special proceedings under FRCP Rule 60B 3 and D for fraud upon the court by certain parties of interest. Please file said motion on my behalf using the ECF system to serve a true copy on all interested parties. Those parties including but not limited to the following: Brian Christopher Baldrate, Francis Joseph Warren, Gibson Dunn and Crutcher and LLP, Washington, D.C., David Penn Burns, Gibson Dunn Crutcher LLP, Washington, D.C., Brendan V. Sullivan, Jr., Craig D. Singer, Alex Giscard, Romaine, Beth A. Stewart, Williams and Connolly, LLP, Washington, D.C., Joseph Marshall Terry, Jr., Robert Madison Carey, Williams and Connolly, LLP, Washington, D.C. Page 2, Honorable Clerk of Court. Edward P. Sullivan, Nicholas A. Marsh, Petty Merkamp Stemler, William J. Stuckwish, Brenda K. Morris, David L. Jaffe, U.S. Department of Justice, Washington, D.C., James A. Goki, Joseph W. Bottini, U.S. Attorney's Office, District of Alaska, Anchorage, Alaska, Paul M. O'Brien, United States Department of Justice, Narcotic and Dangerous Drugs Section, Criminal Division, Washington, D.C. Sincerely, Francis Schaeffer Cox. Okay, page, new page. In the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, Francis Schaeffer Cox, interested, affected, and injured party, non-party movement petitioner, in the matter of in related special proceedings. Miscellaneous number 9-0198 EGS, Honorable Emmett J. Sullivan, U.S. District Judge, filed 5/26/14. Motion to waive filing free and proceed in forma pauperis, and motion to appoint counsel to protect injured parties' interest. Comes now Francis Schaeffer Cox, and under penalty of perjury, pursuant to 28 U.S.C. 1746, as an injured non-party but party of interest, and respectfully moves this honorable court to waive any filing fee and allow movement to proceed pro se. Movement swears and affirms he is incarcerated, indigent, over the age of majority, and a citizen of the United States and state of Alaska, and that further he has been declared indigent and had counsel appointed in his behalf in the U.S. District Court for the District of Alaska and on appeal in the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, where he is currently on direct appeal under 18 U.S.C. 3006A. Further, movement moves this honorable court to appoint counsel to protect the interest of movement as an interested non-party, and if the court finds movement's motion to reopen proceedings under Federal Rule Civil 60B 3 and D3 for the fraud upon the court is well taken. Movement asserts it is in the public interest to determine if the movement's allegations can be factually supported and to determine the extent of the egregious misconduct, deceit, and fraud on the court that occurred, and for the court to craft appropriate remedy. So swear I under penalty of perjury under 28 U.S.C. 1746. Respectfully submitted, Francis Schaeffer. Next page. Okay. Motion for access to report to the Honorable Emmett G. Sullivan of investigation pursuant to the court's April 7, 2009 order. Interested, affected, and injured non-party petitioners motion to reopen special proceedings under the FRCP Rule 60B3 and D for fraud upon the court by certain parties of interest. Comes now Francis Schaeffer Cox, proceeding in propria persona as an incarcerated indigent natural citizen of the United States over the age of majority, and respectfully moves this honorable United States Court to grant movement access to the report to the Honorable Emmett G. Sullivan of investigation pursuant to the court's order of April 7, 2009. Hereafter, Mr. Schulke's report. And or also moves this Honorable United States District Court to reopen the above named, numbered, and styled cause of action, to wit, in the matter of in related special proceedings on the basis of fraud upon the court pursuant to FRCP Rule 60B3 and D, committed by certain previously sanctioned and unsanctioned parties and unknown or unnamed parties who participated in continuing Brady, Giglio, Kyle's infra violations and or continued prosecutorial and investigative misconduct against other targets of Operation Polar Pin, including your movement, who was injured and is being injured. New page. Movement, a State House candidate and successful grassroots organizer, was one of several victims of the Anchorage U.S. Attorney's politically motivated prosecutions codenamed Operation Polar Pin. The Polar Pin team made sensational accusations against movement. Documents have recently surfaced that indicate that they knew these accusations were false all along. This court is already familiar with the fraud and deception that characterized the Operation Polar Pin. What this court may not be aware of is that though even greater acts of fraud and deception, the parties in question were able to prevent the investigation ordered by this court and discovering the full extent and seriousness of their prosecutorial misconduct. Movement now seeks to bring to this honorable court's attention previously concealed misconduct which, because it was not revealed at the time, prevented Mr. Schulke from making a fully informed recommendation as to the appropriate sanctions, deprived this court of information vital to its decision-making, and most importantly, is allowing injustices to be continued and expanded. In the interest of justice, movement petitions this court to reopen its Polar Pin investigation. In support thereof, movement proffers the following good presence. It is at least a reasonable inference, if not beyond peradventure, that the Polar Pin Task Force, ergo the Alaskan U.S. Attorney's Office, the Alaskan State Troopers, Police, and the Anchorage Police Department upper echelon joined in an effort to manipulate not only the political landscape in Alaska, but in the nation by use of the Polar Pin Task Force resources to defeat, discredit, or incarcerate political figures, not the least of which was United States Senator Ted Stevens, head of the Senate Finance Committee, Don Young, longtime U.S. Congressman, and other GOP political figures, or office holders in the state able to influence elections. Your movement herein was once such up and coming political activist, candidate, and fundraiser who is able to enroll thousands of young new libertarian GOP voters. New page. Alaska is a state with only 713,000 or so citizens. Statewide elections have perhaps in a presidential election 315,000 voters. A normal election turns out around 250,000 voters statewide. 5,200 votes made the difference in whether Joe Miller or Lisa Murkowski became U.S. Senator. The already judicially determined misconduct of the Polar Pen Task Force defeated longtime Senator Ted Stevens and changed the control of the Senate to the Democratic Nebraskan Senator Ben Nelson. Democrats already controlled the House of Representatives. For better or worse, the Polar Pen Task Force set the stage for passage of the Affordable Care Act. Without comment by your movement as to whether that will bode ill or well for the country, it changed drastically the direction of this nation socially as to health care, and it was done via prosecutorial misconduct, abuse of prosecutorial power, not by a fair vote of the people. Your movement is in his libertarian activism was registering thousands of new conservative young voters capable of changing the political landscape in Alaska, and in particular challenging the Democratic president and his administration's push for new gun control laws and firearms registration. Movement was drawing thousands of supporters to his rallies. He was raising funds, enrolling voters very successfully, and pushing state legislation, including passage of the Alaskan Firearms Freedom Act. Movement believes it was because of this he was targeted by the Polar Pen Task Force members. Movement has documentation within a hard drive containing some of his discovery that he is not allowed to print out that states that the AUSA assigned to his case was Joseph Bottini. There were 3 FBI co-case officers, Sandy Klein, Richard Sutherland, and Bruce Milleen, as well as other FBI agents known and unknown to movement. These federal agents / attorneys were running the Polar Pen sting in conjunction with Alaska State Police over the objections new page of the AUSA from Fairbanks, Alaska, where movement lived. Your Honor, during the very time these prosecutors were being investigated at your direction, this is what they were doing behind your back. Movement is not a criminal and had no criminal associations or predispositions toward the types of crimes the Polar Pen team tried to bully him into committing. Your movement was raised in Colorado, where he was homeschooled by his parents, both teachers, his father, a West Pointer, and uncle, a former chief of staff to U.S. Senator David Boren, owned and operated assisted living homes for seniors. The Cox family became very well off as a result. When movement was 16, his father took a pastoral position at a large Baptist church in Fairbanks, Alaska, having been introduced to backpacking, fishing, mountaineering, and the great outdoors by his father in Colorado. Your movement was enthralled with Alaska. At 17, he set a goal to climb 20,320-foot McKinley within a year, which he did in a 48-day expedition. Movement worked in the Alaskan fishing industry in construction on the Army's Fort Wainwright military base, learning CAD, computer automated design and construction, operating heavy equipment, and ultimately had his own successful residential construction, design, and landscaping business. At 18, he married his wife Marty, and he again climbed Mount McKinley with his father in 2003. In 2005, he climbed Mount McKinley for the 3rd time with his wife. They taught Sunday school, were certified foster care parents, volunteered in the community, and were the quintessential upstanding wilderness-loving Alaskan family. Movement became involved in Congressman Ron Paul's presidential campaign and was recognized as an effective campaign organizer. At the next GOP convention, the lieutenant governor asked Movement to run for state representative from the convention podium, which he ultimately did. He garnered 38% of the vote at age 24 in a 3-man race against an entrenched incumbent. At the same convention, he was first approached by Polar Pen informant Bill Fulton, who asked him to help rig an internal party election, which Movement declined to do. After losing his race for state representative, Movement Cox began a Second Amendment campaign against the Obama administration's gun control efforts, honoring his public speaking skills, honing his public speaking skills, holding rallies, gaining name recognition and a political base of conservatives, constitutionalist, Ron Paul style of libertarians who were for less government, more freedom and less regulation, especially in the area of the Bill of Rights. Some of these supporters' followers had extreme views. Movement had a politician's habit of giving soft answers. When asked to support a position, cause, or idea that was unacceptable, he would listen to, appear to give it a thoughtful consideration, reassure the speaker that he understood the merits of the speaker's idea, then gently point out the flaws and shortcomings of the proposal so as not to alienate his potential political supporters or create political enemies unnecessarily. During these speeches, movement came to the attention of the investigators and prosecutors, federal officials, and Alaskan state or local police who composed the Polar Pen Task Force, responsible for the dubious investigation and prosecutions of U.S. Senator Ted Stevens, former Alaskan House Speaker Peter Cote, and also former Alaskan State Representative Victor H. Coring and Bruce H. Wybrock. As this court well knows, all were convicted by the Joint State Federal Polar Pen Task Force, and all were reversed for failure to disclose the Brady Giglio Kyle's materials. FN1. Footnote 1. Movement then continued to fundraise and build his political base by holding rallies for Second Amendment rights and other issues that were popular at the time, including local police corruption. Movement asserts by reasonable inference that the Polar Pen players, whose true agenda was to influence Alaskan elections and in turn influence the administration's national agenda, realized. And then there's also at the bottom of page 5 is a footnote 1. If people care to look at the document, it'll be on Dropbox. New page. This is page is numbered 6. That movement's Second Amendment movement and rallies and his voter registration success was a threat to their overall goals. They then ran numerous attempts to entice movement to commit crimes. These undercover agents repeatedly told their FBI handlers movement was not willing to possess illegal weapons or commit acts of violence for over 2 years and through at least 3 operatives. AUSA Bottini continued to insert less and less credible ethical undercover operatives who were willing to do anything to threaten, scare, induce movement to commit illegalities. Operatives who would lie, steal, and violate laws. AUSA Joseph Bottini's prosecutorial philosophy that the ends justify any means is seen throughout the Polar Pen sting operation against movement, just as it was against Senator Ted Stevens, Victor Coring, Peter Cott, and Bruce Wybrock. The multiple and escalating attempts at movement are as follows. Attempt 1, simple offer. Movement believes the first Polar Pen undercover effort was when he was approached by a man named Chris Menino, who bragged of the sophisticated weaponry he possessed, including explosives. Mr. Menino voiced his support for movement's campaign and made modest donations. Mr. Menino later offered to supply movement with high explosives to kick some shit off, at which point movement distanced himself from Mr. Menino. After trial, Mr. Menino was found to have been an informant. Through the Polar Pen prosecutors refused to make formal disclosures or supply additional discovery regarding Mr. Menino. Attempt 2, monetary incentives. After Menino, a man named Aaron Bennett came on the scene. Bennett represented himself as the leader of a large militia with lots of money and ability to raise a lot more, which he did. Bennett hosted multiple fundraisers and donated thousands of dollars to support movement's rallies and campaigning. Bennett also started giving movement expensive gifts on a regular basis, including rifle scopes, smoke canisters, outdoor clothing and equipment, winter survival gear, body armor, 37mm flare launchers, and smoke fuses for practice grenades. Most of the time, movement would turn around and sell these gifts and just keep the money. Bennett convinced movement that the best way to increase donations was to start a militia. Seeing that Bennett had what appeared to be an almost unlimited ability to raise money, movement tried to organize a militia of his own. Movement now reasonably believes that ATF, Fairbanks Police, and other state and federal actors use surplus shops, gun shops in Alaska as undercover listening posts to gather information on conservative or constitutional rights groups. For example, Far North Tactical was run by Aaron Bennett, who the government refused to disclose as an informant, but merely stated that they could neither confirm nor deny his involvement. Aaron Bennett was perfectly positioned to infiltrate militia, sovereign citizens movements, Tea Party conservatives, Second Amendment, constitutional rights movements, and probably still is. This explains the government attorney's refusal to confirm or deny whether or not he is their informant. Bennett approached movement making offers to provide illegal weapons and gave movement without cost body armor, smoke fuses, dummy grenade shells, hornet's nest canisters, 37mm flare guns, as well as donations to movement's political causes. Bennett was aggressive in urging movement to abandon his passive, non-violent political Second Amendment approaches to change and instead use offensive, violent type tactics or force. Aaron Bennett told movement to lead of bleed, that if he wasn't going to attack the government, Bennett would kill movement and blame it on the federal government to incite movement support to rise up. Movement began to distance himself from Bennett and warned others to do so as well. While movement was able to draw thousands of people to political rallies, organizing them into a viable militia turned out to be impossible, and it certainly was not a goldmine of donations as promised. By June 2010, the actual militia part was defunct and nothing more than a failed experiment. The FBI noted this. Sentencing memorandum, page 24, moving on to new page. The page is numbered 8. From Espelander Derek D. Monday Arjun Lokeshar Lisa SC has gone from a cadre of 24 down to 2, him and his number 2 Les Derby. Over time, Bennett became very pushy and insisted that violent acts against government officials were needed. When movement wouldn't go along with his thinking, Bennett started making subtle threats to harm movement. Movement subsequently avoided Bennett and advised others to do the same. After trial, Bennett was found to have been an informant through the Polar Pen prosecutors, though the Polar Pen prosecutors refused to make formal disclosure or supply additional discovery, despite the fact that he was allowed to testify at trial. Sentencing memorandum, page 17, referencing FBI's covert recordings in another portion that was included in government exhibit, Cox stated, "But then I'm not, he's Aaron Bennett constantly pushing me. You've got to just fight and start the killing. You know, and figure it out later, you know, and I'm being very temperate and no hold back. Let's not be premature. That's just retaliation. That's just vindictive, Oh, Nelly, whoa, Nelly, pump your brakes, Mr. Olson, put the reins on. Mr. Cox, and Aaron Bennett, got sick of me. Cox, saying, you pump your brakes too much, and now I think where he's at is he's trying to destroy me because I'm a cork and a bottleneck. Okay, morning of February the 19th, Ken, what about Lonnie? You told me a couple of days ago when you said that Aaron FBI was Lonnie. He's going to kill all of us. Yeah, we're all fucking dead. We're all fucking dead. Karen, that was his exact words. Ken, and what was and that was Lonnie, and you got to see a taste of it down there too. JR, oh yeah, last weekend. Lonnie, last weekend. Ken, but that was real recent, like the last time you inaudible. Karen, it was before that. It was the weekend before that, because when Lonnie and Aaron went to the summit, Ken gets ready to leave. He offers a prayer of protection. Ken, Yahweh, I just pray for the complete protection we need right now. Help us remain in honor before you because of your promises. If we do not engage in iniquity and lawlessness, that you would feed us, and to just engage in the evil, that of the evil people that come against us, and to work evil on us, and to wait on you, and we would take care of it. We just pray. Schaeffer, and a lot of those folks, like Bill FBI and Norm, like Bill FBI and Aaron FBI, I think are better to just let lie. Schaeffer, I think we just need to have a policy of avoiding Aaron FBI and his pack, because that is just a bunch of hedonistic, scrappy, directionless brawlers. These tapes were not played for the jury. Attempt 3, threaten children, knife to throat. So attempt 1 was a simple offer by Polar Pen operative Chris Menino. Attempt 2 was a monetary incentive to start a militia. Attempt 3 is threaten the children with knife to throat. After Menino and Bennett, a man named Bill Fulton was inserted into the sting by the FBI Polar Pen Task Force. Unlike Menino, who simply offered the opportunity to commit a crime, or Bennett, who used monetary incentives and subtle forms of coercion, Fulton capitalized upon a threat to movement's family, then resorted to using actual physical violence to induce the commission of a crime. On February 25th, 2010, Movement was charged with a 1 misdemeanor count of reckless endangerment after an argument that involved his wife and mother-in-law. The following June, the Alaska Office of Child Services showed up at Movement's home and informed Movement that there was a complaint of child neglect. While it was routine for OCS to make a house call after an incident of domestic violence, such child welfare checks take place within hours or at most days of an incident. Additionally, reckless endangerment is specifically a nonviolent offense. The complaint OCS acted on was a separate complaint made by police that alleged an unsafe environment based off of Facebook photos. This allegation was found to be unsubstantiated after an investigation by OCS, but not before Bill Fulton incorporated it into his attempted sting. Page 10. While Movement and his wife, through their attorney, were trying to make arrangements for OCS to conduct their inspection without giving up custody of their baby during the pendency of the investigation, Fulton, whom Movement had met only once or twice before, drove 350 miles from Anchorage to Fairbanks and requested a meeting with Movement. Movement agreed, but when he arrived with his baby and his elderly friend, Mr. Zerby, he was met only by Fulton, but he was met not only by Fulton but by Bennett and several other thugs. The Polar Print prosecutors did not turn over the recordings of this meeting, but on the recording, Fulton himself describes what happened. From Sentencing Memorandum PP 22 and 23. As Fulton told Vernon on February the 2nd, the only reason I didn't break it off with Schaeffer's group was because of Schaeffer after that thing with Les. Yeah. Olson said yeah. Vernon said yeah. Olson. So it must have been pretty bad, pretty tense with Les, huh? Fulton. Oh, I was seriously going to kill him. Olson, is that right? Fulton. I was going to fucking end his existence on this planet. Yeah, I was not fucking around at all. What happened was, that was the last summer when Schaeffer didn't know which way it was going to go with the cops, whether or not they were going to come try to take his kid. And essentially he, Schaeffer, Unaudible Hotel, and they were sitting there and they were talking and they said, look, this is what's going to happen. And when Les said this is what's going to happen after they left, I started making an audible. I had fucking trucks coming to pick up our appliances and fucking an audible because they said it's a go and it's going to happen. So we had a meeting over at Aaron's shop the next day. We're all standing around and there's people coming in, you know. I mean, I was in like $5-6 grand at the time and I'm like, okay, it's going to happen. You know, let's do it. Mr. Olson, we're ready, yeah. Fulton, yeah, and so we're standing there, and Schaeffer's supposed to be there, but he had something else to do, so he's like an hour late. So I was drinking some beers, not that I normally drink during the day. I'm just saying. And the meeting finally starts, and we're talking, and he, look, Les, what is the plan here? We have people in motion. We have things, events, Olson happening, Fulton unfolding. That is your guys' show. What's your plan? And he's like, well, we don't have a plan. And I'm moving on to page 11. I just fucking lost it. I literally grabbed a knife, started coming over the counter, and I was like, I'll fucking slit your throat open, Inaudible, you fucking piece of shit. What do you mean you don't have a fucking plan? I was like, that's all you guys do is a fucking plan. What the fuck is your plan? Well, we thought you guys would have one. Emphasis added. This tape was not played for the jury. From Sentencing Memorandum PP 2122, Trial Testimony, Michael Anderson, May 15th, 12 day, page 36 and 37. Day 6, page 36 and 37. Bill Fulton wants to know what's the plan. How are we going to do this? And then all of a sudden, Les Zerby pipes up and says, there's no plan. We don't have a plan to do this. And Bill Fulton at that point, and my memory's a little vague, and I don't remember if he actually pulled out a knife or not. I would say my memory is like 50% on that, and I want to say he did, but I can't say it firmly. What I distinctly remember is him kind of lunging toward Les Zerby and saying, no plan, what do you mean, you piece of shit? You're supposed to have a plan, you fucking piece of shit. I'm going to slit your throat. I'm going to kill you, Les. And he kept going on and on and on. And Les Zerby and Schaeffer were very calm, and finally things calmed down a bit after several minutes of this nonsense. And, Schaeffer says, We just don't have a plan and we don't have a logistics for this. We can't do it. What do you mean you don't have logistics, Schaeffer? I spent $30,000 bringing men and equipment up here. You want me to send them all back? And Bill Fulton, Bill Fulton was continuing with this. Schaeffer finally just says, Bill, look, I've never been in a fight in my life. I've never even punched someone in the nose, and I don't want to start now. And when Fulton says, what do you want me to do, Schaeffer? You want me to call it off? And Schaeffer says, yeah, call it off. And so from that point, Schaeffer says, yeah, call it off. And so from that point on, it cooled down. It looked like Schaeffer had convinced Fulton to call it off. And after these events, Movement became fearful for his life. Movement avoided both Fulton and Bennett at all costs and was very cautious not to say or do anything that would upset either of them. From sentencing memorandum page 20, Mr. Cox also expressed his fear of being killed to people who did not testify at the trial, including his father, Gary Cox. He thought his life was threatened by these informants. One day, he and Marty came to our home and sat down to tell me he thought he would kill him and make it look like a murder-suicide. Movement sought help from several law enforcement agencies. Movement sought help from several law enforcement agencies and officials. Movement called Rex Leith of the state troopers, who offered no help and declined to question Movement about the dangerous people. I'm going to stop here on page 12. Okay, let's pick back up with page 12. Movement called Rex Leith of the state troopers, who offered no help and declined to question Movement about the dangerous people he referred to. Movement and his wife went to the home of acquaintance and state trooper Ron Wall, who also declined to question Movement and offered no help. The Polar Pen prosecutors have furnished no discovery in relation to these interactions with non-federal agencies. However, Movement notes that under U.S. v. Tillman, 210 U.S. District Lexus 78814, July 9, 2010, D.C., Nevada, U.S. v. Blanco, 392 F.3D, 382, 388, 9th Circuit, 2004, they are obligated to. Having received no help from the local police, who were previously the object of Movement's anti-corruption initiative, Movement and his wife sought help from the military police on Fort Wainwright, whereas Movement had been employed. When they had told Movement and his wife, what they told Movement and his wife was chilling. From testimony of Gibson Military Police, TR 15-253, 15-254, 15-255. Answer. And his exact words were that with some of the issues that had been going on with Schaeffer Cox, that the OCS issue actually may resolve the problem that they had. And so the U.S. Marshal said, based off that statement, that when OCS would go to Schaeffer Cox's house to get his son, law enforcement would be present. He also stated that they believed, based off his statement from taking his child, that if he did so, then he would most likely be shot and killed in this scenario. That was basically, okay, I gave him the disc and the federal marshal. What did you mean with he said that it would fix the problem? I don't know what the problem was. What was it that you thought he was referring to when he said fix the problem? You may not know what the problem, but what was he referring to when he said fix the problem? Whatever the problem was with Schaeffer Cox, it was if he was killed with the OCS attempting to take his son, then obviously anything that had to do with him wouldn't matter anymore. At some point after that, how did you respond to that? What did you do? After the U.S. Marshals left, my supervisor was present, and so I consulted with him about it. He didn't want to get involved. He said he wasn't going to get involved. So I worked a 12-hour shift. I worked in an office. I have a computer, stuff like that, so I got on the internet. I started to do some research about Schaeffer Cox, and I started to pull up information, read about him, about how he'd run for public office, stuff like that. I didn't see any reason. I couldn't tell that he was under any kind of criminal investigation or that there were any necessarily investigations going on at that time. So I looked him up on Facebook to see if he had a Facebook account, and he did. So I sent him a message. I told him I would like to meet with him, and he got back with me pretty quickly and told me he would be willing to meet with me, and so we did. Why did you feel that you had to do that? My goal was to resolve an issue. Hearing this frightened Movement and his wife so much that they moved out of their house for their safety. From Sentencing Memorandum, page 20. His friend Richard Neff, on more than one occasion before he was counted as a fugitive, Schaeffer, Marty, Seth, took refuge in our home because Schaeffer feared the government was going to launch some intrusion to harm his family. Mira Ness told the probation officer that Mr. Cox repeatedly said that the government was out to get him. Fortunately, OCS agreed to simply follow their policies, and an ordinary inspection was conducted and the case closed. This somewhat relieved Movement's fears. However, Movement continued to ask for help dealing with the remaining threats posed by Fulton and Bennett, both under Polar Pen's direction. Movement told everyone who would listen about the situation and became more and more paranoid about the agents the military police had warned him about, who were now rumored to be Team 6. Movement eventually went so far as to give a television interview on a local station in an effort to expose what was happening. Movement shared his concerns with his friend, whom he deeply respects, Mr. Steve Cooper, who has been the sole AUSA in Fairbanks for 30 years. From trial transcripts, page 19-9 and 19-10, AUSA Cooper recalled, "Answer, and what I think was probably the last time that I had lunch with Mr. Cox, not sure, but I think it was in the middle of 2010 at some time, so I am not more accurate on dates, but at that time Mr. Cox conveyed his belief that there were people in his group that were of a different mindset or set of opinions than those that were consistent with the rest of the group. Attempt 4, a death threat ultimatum. After Menino, Bennett, and Fulton, a man named Gerald Olson came on the scene. Olson stoked the fears that the previous informants had created. Morning of February 19th, audio file 021-911, CHX Cox, Vernon, Barney, 858-16, 1902-11, 223-34. JR, FBI, what happened? Say, I want to be able to know in my mind what's going to happen. You know, worst case scenario now. I want to go through this. Say, they come for you tonight and beat doors down. How are we gonna to know to get out there and defend you? You know, because if they shut down the Liberty Bell somehow, and if we don't have that now, then what? What do we do in that situation? You know, worst case scenario. This tape was not played for the jury. Olson, after being instructed by Fulton to do so, renewed Fulton's death threat ultimatum. From Sentencing Memorandum, page 23. Fulton, okay, so when you guys get back, what you need to do is have a talk with Schaeffer and remind Schaeffer about what happened last time, that when I almost killed Les. Olson, yeah, he remembers that. Fulton, well, I'm sure he does, but I want you to remember him. 2512 transcript, page 130. This portion of this meeting was not played for the jury. After meeting successfully, keeping out the aforementioned evidence, the Polar Pen prosecutors made these knowingly false statements to the jury. And Bill Fulton's going to be down there, right? But Bill Fulton, I'm afraid, is trying to kill me. Aaron Bennett is going to be down there. Aaron Bennett, I'm afraid, is trying to kill me. I submit to you folks, you've got 5 hours of audio, okay? You try to find a statement anywhere about Bill Fulton's trying to kill me, Aaron Bennett's trying to kill me. You're not going to find it. You can look through all the documents and you can go through all 900 of them. You're not going to find it. But the deal is, you're not going to find any evidence except what this guy Cox said on the stand last week, and that Bill Fulton and Aaron Bennett were out to kill him. And that's why I've got these big concerns, and that's why I told the court this, and that's why I told the court that. There is nothing in there in this case. He didn't tell this to the AUSA Cooper. He didn't tell anybody that these two guys were coming after him, and that's why he did what he did. That's part of the blame the government thing, right? It's the government's fault that we're all here. It's the investigators' fault that we're all here. It's Bill Fulton's fault we're all here, and Gerald Olson, etc. You're not going to hear that. You're going to hear it, but it's not going to be substantiated. And you heard the man testify to you after 4 weeks of trial, and he comes up with this story about the Fulton conspiracy. It's going to take another step after this. We'll get to that too. Because frankly, folks, he lied to you. Trial transcript, page 22-69, 22-70, and 22-76. For 2 years leading up to this point, movement had flatly rejected the proposals of violence with which the informants relentlessly bombarded him. Even when faced with the threats of a knife-wielding Bill Fulton and or threats to his children, movement still held that violence was not the answer. Sentencing memorandum, page 16 and 17. Cox also emphasized that the plan would never actually work. Mr. Cox, even if we followed the 2-for-1 scenario out what I see, and this is from what I've seen with even our guys and stuff like that, everybody that, the idea of patriotism and the idea of what we're doing, they love the idea, but what I see will happen if they grab you and we go for a 2-for-1, it's going to be Mr. Olson, us three, we have Vernon. Well, we have Vernon, Mr. Cox, and you guys, won't be able to be involved with it until they fail to see enough sufficient force, even on them, to justify, they'll just stand and it will be the three of us. Mr. Olson, well, we have Vernon, we'd have 4, Lonnie, because I think Lonnie would be right with Mr. Cox. Yeah, there'd be 4 of us and it will be real quick and it will be over. And they will, and all this, and all it's going, and it's been doing will be gone away, and they'll say, well, I guess that was that, and he was a wacko, just like I know the media painted him out to be, and I think that'll be the end of it. I don't think that our war will just be over like that. Government Exhibit 14-2-1211, page 100 and 101. On February 12, 2011, after a long discussion about the 2-for-1 plan, Cox said, Mr. Cox, so we're all on the same page. The plan as far as 2-for-1 is to bluff it, pray, and work towards not being a bluff, and work towards it not being a bluff. And then at the moment, my plan is to hide, to avoid if I get busted. If I get captured, I'm going to do I'm not going to do a Rambo. I'm going to do a Gandhi. Let me read that again. If I get captured, I'm not going to do a Rambo. I'm going to do a Gandhi. So I'm not going to carry an ID. I'm not going to do anything. Emphasis added. The recording of the February 19th meeting reveals that Mr. Cox ultimately rejected the 2-for-1 plan. This particular segment was not included in Exhibit 24 of the February 19th meeting, but does appear in the transaction at 140. Mr. Barney, yeah, we're all in this together, but I know right now the atmosphere, I don't feel it's right to, if we take up arms, it's going to be, I wonder if anything would really even come out of it other than we'll be dead and our wives and children will be left to themselves. I don't think that people around us won't see us as martyrs. Miss Vernon, Moving on to the next page, 16. Speaker number, Mr. Cox. It will be a fruitless gesture, emphasis added. These tapes were not played for the jury. Movement flees the country to escape informants. On February 4th, 2011, a beautiful baby girl was born to Schaeffer and Marty, Movement and his wife. She was their second child and first girl. Less than 24 hours later, Movement received the Fultons' renewed death threat. Fulton. Remind Schaeffer about what happened last time when I almost killed Les. Sentencing memorandum, page 23. This tape was not played for the jury. 2 years of coercive intimidation from informants had driven Movement and his wife to their breaking point. The birth of a child coupled with the latest threat from Fulton put them over the edge, and they decided to move out of the country. Sentencing memorandum, page 26. Cox also made it clear he planned to leave Alaska to avoid a confrontation with the government. Mr. Cox, I lost my house, my business, my whole fortune, because that's okay, and I could if I was looking for a fight and I was feeling vengeful with what's wrong with feeling vengeful, man? We've been wronged. I could go out and I could sock it to them, and that would satisfy my animalistic reaction to their wrongdoing, righteous wrath though it may be. Mr. Olson, Mr. Cox, but it would be detriment to the war, and so because I believe you and that me losing everything and just walking away from it, get me back to your friend's container, get me smuggled through Canada with nothing but a gym bag and a rifle, and we lose everything and get the scales and let the scales keep tipping. That's what I think has the brightest future for my family. Mr. Olson, Mr. Cox, because only when there is no future and there is no hope for my wife and for my children can I then spend myself only in costing. Mr. Olson, Mr. Cox, the enemy. Mr. Barney, Mr. Cox, because costing the enemy is not my objective. Yeah. Mr. Olson, yeah. Mr. Cox, I would forgive them and have all sorts of redemption and go to a picnic with them if they'd just leave me alone. Mr. Olson, yeah. Mr. Cox, I don't have hatred towards them. This tape was not played for the jury. However, this decision did not alleviate the immediate danger that Fulton presented. Movement had been sternly warned of the consequences he faced if he continued to refuse to plot violent crimes. Movement was aware of Fulton's violent reputation and had indeed experienced it firsthand. The last time Movement said no to Fulton's violent proposals, Fulton flew into a rage and started attacking people with a hunting knife. Fulton's threat was credible and caused Movement to reasonably believe that he would be killed if he rejected Fulton's proposal. Movement needed to get out of the country without letting word to get Fulton that Movement was still unwilling to act out violently. The FBI noted this. From Sentencing Memorandum, page 23, Sutherland, Richard A. Jr., Klein, Sandra L. Locascio, Lisa A. Plan. Friday, March 4, 2011, 5:33 p.m. Schaeffer Cox is not willing to meet with CHS-2 Fulton. Does not want him to know he is still in Fairbanks. Wants CHS-1 Olson to broker deals. So Schaeffer Cox willing to meet Trucker to discuss transport Rick Sutherland. It was during this time that Movement regrettably, but perhaps understandably, switched from saying no to giving qualified denials and other open-ended and non-committal answers. Movement wasn't about to agree to commit a crime, but now he couldn't say no either. Olson pushed all the more. From addendum to the pre-sentence report, document 535-1, sealed, page 79 of 96 and 80 of 96, Francis Schaeffer Cox, 3:11 CR 00022-RJB-1. From Stephen Scrocky, USAAK, sent Sunday, February 13th, 2011, 4:13 p.m. to Karen Loeffler. Let me just say for the record that Stephen Scrocky and Karen Loeffler are the most wicked evildoers on this planet. They should suffer God's wrath for what they have done to Schaeffer Cox and his family. Subject, this email is from Stephen Scrocky to Karen Loeffler. Subject, Cox, long email, sorry. Listen to the conversation from last night. In summary, they are kicking around ideas. My advice, do not arrest him if he doesn't show sick, but issue the warrant and let it sit. They discuss not being strong enough to impose their views on the rule of law. They discuss everything from 241 to fleeing to the rapture, coming and waiting for that. In my view, the FBI source is pushing Cox a bit too hard on getting arrested, and the source agrees. Wait a minute, let me read that again. They discuss everything from 241 to fleeing to the rapture, coming and waiting for that. In my view, the FBI source is pushing Cox a bit too hard on not getting arrested, and the source agrees too much in moving their plans forward, which would generate a response, whether violent or not. The source adds, why don't we make it 5-for-1? Not a good idea. FBI has to fix this. After some investigation of 241, Cox says, we're just speculating here and I want to hear where you stand. Cox stated thoughts are, we are not strong enough to execute or follow through, and says they should do everything we can to avoid it. Doesn't sound like he's embracing 241. They should do everything we can to avoid it. The source says we can get other militias to support us. Another example of pushing. Cox says we want to bluff them and play and train. I think it means pray, but he writes play. And ask, what do you guys think about this then? And after getting various responses, none saying let's go grab or harm people tomorrow, he ends it with bluff it. I think he means pray, but he writes play and dream. He says at the moment his plan tomorrow is to lay low, and if he gets caught, to play Gandhi, not Rambo. Again, he qualifies almost everything. It's very obvious he wants wiggle room. Movement was due in court for a low-level misdemeanor that had resulted from an arrest that occurred during an anti-corruption protest the year before. Fulton stated that he and his friends intended to use this charge as an excuse to act out violently. Audio file 021211 CHS and Cox 10:06:17 12:02:11 123:55. Schaeffer. And then you got to worry about loose cannons like Aaron, FBI, JR with the FBI. Well, FBI, Bill FBI, and Aaron FBI are ready to go. 12425 Schaeffer, I think they are too hedonistic. 33500 JR FBI. JR FBI said Bill FBI had talked to him about getting ready to come up and that he would be ready. He needs a 2-day notice to come to get all this men up to Fairbanks to defend you on this, on February 14th on your court date. He said they're ready to go. He can have this guy rallied and rounded in 2 days, and just let Schaeffer know, get the word to him somehow. 22510 Schaeffer, I guess that's kind of the thing. I'm getting out of here. The tape was not played for the jury. Attempt number 5, disabled vehicle. At this, Movement expressed his intent to leave the country for his safety, packed up his wife and children, and drove toward Canada. Olson caught up to Movement and then the next day and disabled Movement's vehicle. From a letter from Attorney Robert John to Attorney Suzanne Elliott. Law Office of Robert John, P.O. Box 73570, Fairbanks, Alaska 99707. 907-456-6056, 907-456-6057, fax, November 12, 2013. One thing that surprised me about the government's response to the motion to suppress and to dismiss was that the government made little effort to dispute the facts. There was no affidavit from J.R. Olson or anyone else to dispute what Schaeffer said. Perhaps that is not surprising, since the government's own records evidence the truckaroos and Schaeffer's exhausted state at that time. In any event, because the government bears the burden of proof, at least as to the warrantless search and seizure issues, and Schaeffer had thoroughly articulated his actual and reasonable expectation of privacy in his affidavit, and there did not appear to be a dispute about the underlying facts, we did not request an evidentiary hearing. As I recall, when we argued the motion to the court, AUSA Scrocky did not address the issues in the motion, but instead went on and on about what a dangerous man Schaeffer was. Having now updated the research, I continue to be struck by the fact that the action of J.R. Olson in restraining Schaeffer to Fairbanks are above and beyond anything I found an invited informer or other government agent being allowed to do. Olson certainly must have panicked when Schaeffer announced he was leaving on February 19, 2011, but Olson's desire to save himself from punishment cannot justify Olson removing the battery from Schaeffer's vehicle and perpetrating the truckaroos to keep Schaeffer in Fairbanks till March the 10th. Now stranded and having been led to believe that Fulton would act out violently given the slightest excuse, Movement accepted Olson's offer to arrange a ride out of Alaska with a trucker. There was no trucker. It was simply a ruse to keep Movement from finding some other way to leave the country. The trucker was delayed for several made-up reasons. During this time, Olson told Movement that he needed to compile a list of officials. Movement, however, was only interested in getting out of the country. The FBI acknowledged this. From Sentencing Memorandum, page 19. In an email dated March 3, 2011, a mere 7 days before the arrest of Mr. Cox, S.A. Sutherland wrote, "Any idea of Cox's intention with the list, especially in light of the fact that he is leaving? In this, the target list of LE and judges? Yes, the list of Leos and targets. No known intention other than more potential deterrence." Emphasis added. Okay, especially in light of the fact that he is leaving. Olson also tried to get Movement to agree to purchase weapons while it was talked about. No agreement was reached, as meeting the trucker and leaving was still Movement's singular objective. The Polar Pen team arranged a takedown that accommodated this. Olson was to give Movement a ride to meet the trucker, then offer him a silenced pistol and a hand grenade to purchase. In audios kept out of the trial, Olson is heard calling his FBI handler prior to the takedown and explaining that the subjects haven't agreed to purchase the weapons and inquiring as to what he should do with them if they are rejected. In the minutes leading up to the arrest, Movement still had not agreed. From Trial Exhibit 38-01, pages 5 and 6, Mr. Olson, from Trial Exhibit 3801, pages 5 and 6, Mr. Olson, these are pretty cool though. I mean, they're pretty sexy. Wait till you see this. But if he doesn't, if we don't like them, I told him, I said, well, I'll take them. I said, I don't know if they're going to go over. He says to make, you don't know what, basically he doesn't want to go back to Anchorage with them. So he'll kind of take whatever we give him. Mr. Cox, skeptical. Mr. Olson, he does have grenades and they're $50 a piece. He'll come down on those and they're the What are they? The M74s? Mr. Cox, I don't know. Once they arrived at the idling 18-wheeler and Movement believed was his ride, Olson placed the weapons in the vehicle to be inspected. But before they could be accepted or rejected, Olson exited the vehicle and crawled underneath it. Moments later, the FBI swarmed Olson's pickup and Movement was arrested. In sum, the Polar Pen Task Force repeatedly inserted undercover informer operatives, giving Movement funds, gifts, attending his rallies, trying to induce Movement to make any agreement to violate state or federal law, entering into any conspiracy to violate any federal or state laws, or agree to or plan any acts of violence. These efforts were hugely unsuccessful, even after using fear, threats, and duress to try to induce Movement to agree with operatives and join the proffered conspiracy. When Movement would distance himself from those agent provocateurs, and after he declined various offers, new undercovers were brought in. Bill Fulton was under the direct control of a female FBI agent assigned to Polar Pen and working closely with AUSAs including Joseph Bottini, Nick Marsh, and others. It is inconceivable that while being closely supervised by this female agent, undercover operative Bill Fulton would have wandered off range and target to join United States senatorial candidate Joe Miller's campaign staff, become his chief of security for the campaign, and promptly arrest, handcuff, and throw to ground prominent members of the Alaskan Anchorage press, and by doing so destroy candidate Miller's huge lead, resulting in 10,000 vote loss to Lisa Murkowski. This happened and will be explained a little later. When Movement rejected all offers to possess or buy illegal firearms or attack state or federal officials, he was first charged in Alaska court by the Alaska State Police Polar Pen Task Force. When Movement was able to have these outrageous charges dismissed and decided to leave the state, federal FBI agents then devised a scheme to prevent Movement from leaving and set up the following situation. Movement was told by J.R. Olson, a person offered over $300,000 in immunity from numerous state and federal offenses, that he had a driver to take him out of state and that they needed to go meet the driver. Olson was told to bring illegal weapons to the meeting, even after telling his FBI handlers that he did not believe Movement would accept the weapons. As soon as Olson was in the truck with Movement and handled the weapons, he jumped out of the truck and hit the ground as agents arrested Movement on those firearms charges. Olson stole over $30,000 in gold from Movement and his wife while helping Movement move from his home. Agents did nothing to investigate this theft. Movement made numerous efforts to tell state and federal officials that his life was in danger and that there were people pushing him to violence. This fell on deaf ears because the same police and U.S. attorneys and others from whom he sought help were involved in the Polar Pen push to coerce and induce Movement to commit illegal acts. The AUSAs and FBI agents continue to violate Brady, Giglio, Kyle's mandates, continue to conceal their misconduct, and deny Movement due process of law, leading to a manifest miscarriage of justice and illegal conviction. During this very time, this court was investigating their related misconduct. Polar Pen patterns of misconduct. It is the position of Movement, as well as several attorneys familiar with the case, that the Polar Pen team impermissibly used coercion, death threats, and actual physical violence in an attempt to induce the commission of a crime. Movement, having no criminal past or association with the rougher elements of society, have been raised in a loving and law-abiding home, naturally was overwhelmed with fear. Frankly put, Movement may have fared better had he not been such a square. The Polar Pen team kept out the recordings of the death threats being made, failed to comply with their Brady, Kyle's, Giglio obligations regarding the first two informants, as well as Movement's interactions with non-federal agencies, kept out all state-of-mind evidence, and barred any argument about their motive for bringing the charge. They then made knowingly false statements to the court and motions practiced to the jury in opening and closing arguments, all of which deprived Movement of a fair trial. Were it not for Movement's inability to print files from the case files and discovery, this statement of facts would have contained a far greater number of corroborative exhibits. The state of mind evidence was especially crucial to defend against the conspiracy to murder federal officials charges, as there were no overt acts or specific object to support that count, only an alleged hypothetical willingness to do something to somebody someday. Had the jury been able to review even just a little bit of evidence presented in this motion, they would have known that Movement was scared and running for his safety, specifically because he would not agree to commit a crime. Movement believes this would have changed the outcome of the trial. Movement also believes that the government and its undercover CIA operatives used illegal coercion, threats of violence, and an actual violent knife-wielding confrontation to induce fear in an attempt to cause Movement to commit federal crimes. Moreover, the government orchestrated a scenario where Movement believed a special government team, or Squad 6, would create a confrontation where he and his family could be killed. This government squad did not exist, but government actors made Movement reasonably believe that it did, and he became more fearful of the government and certain undercover operatives. Meanwhile, another government operative was preying on the fear to induce Movement to violate federal laws. Had the government made proper Brady-Giglio disclosures as to the extent of these threats, acts of violence, potential threats against Movement, he would have had a duress justification defense. See Lamb versus Kelchner, 304 F.3D 256 3D Circuit 2002. Threats by undercover operatives to induce illegalities by threats of violence to defendant. U.S. versus Gomez 92 F.3D 770 Ninth Circuit 1995, and U.S. versus Contentio Fachin 723 F.2D 691 19th Circuit 1983. Duress and justification defenses closely related. Arizona versus Fulminate 492 U.S. at 287. Coercion need not depend on actual violence by a government agent. A credible threat is sufficient. Schneckcloth versus Bustamante 412. Hold on, my computer's got malware. Incredible. 412 U.S. 218 1973. Defendant's confession involuntary. If the government conduct causes, the defendant will to be overborne and his capacity for self-determination critically impaired at 226. Movement will not be alleging outrageous government misconduct during the polar pin entrapment reverse sting operation because, like Bigfoot, a finding of outrageous conduct appears to be a rare animal. See U.S. versus Dyke 718 F.3D 1282 10th Circuit 2013, citing U.S. versus Russell 411 U.S. 423 429 1973, and Hampton versus U.S. 425 U.S. 484 489 1976, and U.S. versus Painter 447 U.S. 727 1976. However, Movement does contend the governmental misconduct, use of coercion, Brady-Giglio super violations, knowing use of uncorrected perjury, false statements to the jury in opening and closing arguments, and mischaracterizations to the trial court and suppression hearings, and motions in limine deprived Movement of fair defenses and violated other protected rights of your Movement. See Painter at ID at 737 N.9. The limitations of the due process clause come into play only when the government activity in question violates some protected right of the defendant. Had the government made proper Brady-Giglio disclosures, I'm going to stop here on page 24. Okay, picking up with page 24. Had the government made proper Brady-Giglio disclosures, had it not engaged in knowing use of perjury or false statements, then Movement would not have been deprived of viable defenses, where even if there was the necessary mens rea or actus rea for these offenses, which Movement denies, the government's conduct forced the Movement into engage in said conduct or induced him to commit a crime he was not predisposed to commit. In Sorrells versus U.S. 282 U.S. 435 at 442 1932, cited in Sherman versus U.S. 356 U.S. 369 1958. However, a different question is presented when the criminal design originates with officials of the government and they implant in the mind of an innocent person the disposition to commit the alleged offense and induce its commission in order that they may prosecute. Thus, Movement will show that the said governmental misconduct deprived him of his due process rights to present viable entrapment, duress, justification defenses, and imperfect entrapment defense at sentencing. See U.S. v. Stauffer 38 F.3D 1103 9th Circuit 1994, Doctrine of Sentencing Entrapment Applied, and U.S. v. McClelland 72.F.3D 717 9th Circuit 1995. Remand for sentencing based on witness undercover agent conduct gave rise to imperfect entrapment defense and a proper sentence reduction. Movement will assert Brady supra, Giglio supra, Kyles versus Whitley 514 U.S. 419 1995, Napu versus Illinois 360 U.S. 264, 1959, Miller versus Pale, 386 U.S. 1, 1967, U.S. versus Aggers, 427 U.S. 97, 1976, and U.S. versus Bagley, 473 U.S. 667 violations where use of known false evidence, false statements presented by the government to the jury in opening and closing arguments and to the trial court prevented movement from presenting an effective defense. Without said cumulative violations, movement asserts the outcome would have been different. For example, AUSA Lamoureux told the jury in opening argument, "You'll hear that Schaeffer Cox told people that he believed there was a plot by the federal government to kill him and his family. We're going to prove to you that's nonsense." TR Tran 2-4 lines 12 through 18. Yet FBI agent Sutherland testified when Movement was arrested, the first thing he did was assure Movement his wife and children were safe and could not be harmed, because he had heard Movement state on numerous occasions that he thought there was some type of federal assassin team looking to kill him. And Agent Sutherland knew Movement had said he believed federal agents wanted to do harm to him and his family. From trial transcript, page 13-213 and 13-214, what did you tell Schaeffer Cox right at the beginning of the interview with him? Answer, the two things that I remember telling him at the beginning were that his family was safe and we would work very hard to make sure that they stayed safe. And then after that, I told him that I heard him state on numerous occasions that he thought there was some type of federal assassin team that was looking to kill him. And I knew that he had said before that he believed federal agents wanted to do harm to him and his family. And we understood that at the Barney house, there were several women and numerous children, and that we would respond accordingly. And I used that as a caveat to let him know that I was being very cautious in treating his family and that they would be safe. Had the government properly met its Bradio Giglio super obligations and not made use of known false evidence testimony, Movement could have shown that this fear of federal agents wanting to harm him and his family was a scenario created by the Polar Pin reverse sting team, and said fear was continually bolstered and reinforced by FBI undercover agents in an attempt to induce through fear and coercion illegal acts by Movement. However, it actually induced fear flight instead of fear fight. And the same is true of the use of threats of violence and actual violence with a knife when Fulton attacked Movement and his associate Les Zerbe, though in closing and throughout trial, the prosecution completely denied this, claiming it was a lie made up by Movement on the stand. There were no crimes committed. Instead, the government piles inference upon inference based on foolish but protected First Amendment speech that was induced by threat, fear, and coercion. See Ingram versus U.S. 361, U.S. 672, 1959, U.S. versus Curley, 838 F.2D, 932, 939, 17th Circuit, 1988. Indeed, even the district court was confused at the conclusion of the Polar Pin team's case. From the trial transcript, page 15 through 31 and 15-32, the court, well, here's the thing that I guess is a little troubling to me. There was no federal agents that we know of. There might as well have been little green men from Mars. And so if it's the existence of the federal agents or the likelihood of federal agents coming to arrest Mr. Cox, is that a condition precedent that has to be met here with some evidence in order to get a conspiracy? Mr. Scrocky, we don't, the court. That's realistic, realistic conspiracy. The district court was confused because, just like judges in all four related political cases, he had been misled by the Polar Pin AUSAs. If the court was confused by the Polar Pin team's misrepresentation, it is quite reasonable to infer that the jury may also have been confused. Movement was not allowed to present state of mind or motive evidence as an exemption to hearsay due to the government's successful motions in limine. There were 200 hours of covert recordings. 3 to 90-second clips were used at trial. There were hours of Movement repeatedly rejecting the government's agents' pushes to induce Movement to engage in purchases of illegal weapons or conspiracy to harm federal officials, even after said agents created the illusion which Movement reasonably believed that there were federal actors who wished to harm Movement and his family. Movement was not allowed to present state of mind, motive statements he made in an uncounseled 8.5-hour debriefing by FBI agent Sutherland and a state police Scott Johnson. How unusual is it that the government did not want to allow the recordings between undercover operatives and Movement to go to jury? How unusual is it that the government did not want an 8.5-hour uncounseled interrogation between the FBI and your Movement to go to the jury? C.I. J.R. Olson theft of $30,000 worth of gold coins belonging to the Cox family is an example of ongoing polar pin misconduct. Mr. Roleyport's investigation reports on the theft compiled much evidence. The theft itself was captured by J.R. Olson's own recorder on the morning of February 19, 2011, as he was helping the Coxes move out of the country. J.R. Olson is heard picking up a box and saying, "Now this is heavy." "What is it?" Mr. Cox replies, "It is pennies." And that it is a shame when inflation has the copper in a penny worth more than 1 cent. Then you hear Olson set the box in the bed of the truck, open the tape lid, and rifle through its contents. While he was doing this, while he is doing this, you hear Mr. and Miss Vernon approach Olson and ask him what he's doing. Olson replies that he is just helping these guys load, as Mr. and Miss Vernon observe him putting several rows of coins in his pockets. After arriving at their destination several minutes later, Olson is heard removing the box from his truck and handing it to Mr. Barney, who comments that the box is heavy. Olson replies, "Yeah, it's gold coins." Later, when the coins were counted, 4 rows or 24 coins worth $30,000 were missing. The silver coins had been left, there never having been any pennies in the box. Investigator Roleyport put together audios, affidavits from witnesses with receipts for the coins and other evidence, which he then attached to a complaint that he filed with the Alaska State Troopers. The troopers went to speak to the appellate's wife, Marty Cox, about the theft. Miss Cox told them that she wanted to talk to them but would like to have her attorney present. The officers told her that they would not speak to her with her attorney or an investigator present, then left. The troopers then told Mr. Roleyport that if they were unable to prove that Olson stole the gold, that they would file charges against Marty Cox. Given the gravity of this threat and the fact that Marty Cox was now the sole provider for her and Mr. Cox's 2 young children, she agreed not to press the complaint. Normally, police do not decline to speak to a theft victim if counsel is present. Moreover, police do not tell a complaining victim that they will be prosecuted if the police were unable to prove the allegations after an investigation. This is the conduct of police who want to kill an investigation, not conduct one. May I say that all you wicked doers, I pray God's wrath and God's justice on you. Olson's FBI handlers should have wanted to know if he had in fact stolen the gold while under supervision. Ordinarily, a polygraph would have been required and an investigation conducted. Such was not the case here. Once the police had succeeded in getting Marty Cox to drop the complaint, the Polar Pen prosecutors filed a motion in limine to bar the defense from questioning Olson about his profitable theft, thus depriving the accused of highly relevant impeachment material that would have reflected not only on Olson but on the FBI's ability to control him. If someone had filed a theft complaint against one of Movent's key witnesses and Movent had threatened that someone in order to them to drop the theft complaint, Movent would have been charged with obstruction of justice. Also, if Movent was ethical, he would have reviewed the facts and confronted the witness about the theft. Had he found that his witness had in fact engaged in theft, he would have withdrawn the witness or at least advised the court and adverse parties. Movent has found partially redacted text and emails that appear to show an inappropriate sexual banter between CI Bill Fulton and his handler S.A. Sandy Klein. It is, however, the redacted portions which are of greater concern. The defense was denied access to the unredacted versions under the guise of immateriality as determined by the Polar Pen prosecution team. Remember that these very prosecutors were caught concealing their wrongdoing in related cases during this same time by claiming immateriality on discoverable material. See this court Judge Sullivan's opinion in 715 Sup 2D U.S. D.C. Washington D.C. 2009 842 F Sup U.S. Washington D.C. 2012. It is reasonable to suspect that the unredacted text and emails would reveal further inappropriate behavior by confidential informant Bill Fulton and or the failure of S.A. Sandy Klein to properly supervise him. Bill Fulton is the operative who made the death threats against Movent for refusing to plot a crime, even going so far as to hold a knife to Les Zerby's throat and threatening to kill him if Movent continued to refuse to plot a crime with C.I. Fulton. See Defense Sentencing Memorandum, page 23 at SEQ. Interestingly enough, during this Polar Pen time frame, C.I. Bill Fulton volunteered to assist U.S. Senatorial candidate Joe Miller, who had just won the GOP primary. C.I. Bill Fulton provided security for the Miller campaign. Then, at an event in Anchorage, C.I. Bill Fulton proceeded to tackle members of the press and handcuff them. This turned the press against Miller in such a powerful way that his campaign took a nosedive, and he lost the general election to moderate candidate Lisa Murkowski, who won on a write-in campaign. Movent asserts that a close examination of communiques between members of the Polar Pen Task Force and the Alaskan U.S. Attorney's Office and its members in the Justice Department would reveal what have previously said, that the Polar Pen Task Force agenda is political. The Polar Pen Task Force has changed control of the United States Senate and the course of the nation, and the Polar Pen Task Force has thus elected both of Alaska's United States senators. AUSA's Bottini and the Polar Pen Task Force was never fighting political corruption. As this court has noted, the government, its prosecutors, and investigative agents are corrupt. They did not follow the law, statutes, agency policy, or court rules in their request for their own political objectives. This court gave what many felt was a less than adequate sanctioned punishment. This court never knew the extent of the misconduct of the government and its agents. If the redacted or otherwise undisclosed material contains evidence of the Polar Pen team using C.I. Bill Fulton as an agent provocateur to sabotage a U.S. senatorial race, the prosecution may well claim that this is not material. However, under Giglio, this would be discoverable impeachment material, as it would demonstrate that the prosecution team was concerned not with investigating and prosecuting criminal violations, but rather with controlling the political landscape. This would have reflected on the integrity of the entire Anchorage U.S. Attorney's Office, as well as their prosecution of Movement, who had been a political candidate and had won 38% of the vote in the last election. In further keeping with the Polar Pen prosecution team pattern in preemptively blocking the revelation of their misconduct, a motion in limine was filed which prevented the defense from asking any questions or making any argument with respect to the prosecution's motives for bringing the case. Perhaps the greatest interest still in the fact that C.I. Bill Fulton surreptitiously recorded several of his debriefing sessions with the Polar Pen team, FBI handlers, and others. In light of this, it is reasonable to infer that he may have also recorded his phone conversations. As thoroughly detailed in Mr. Port's investigative reports, when the Polar Pen prosecutors learned that Fulton had recorded the debriefings, they demanded that he hand over all the tapes to the U.S. Attorney's Office immediately. But when the defense team demanded that the tapes in the government's possession be turned over as part of discovery, the Polar Pen attorneys returned the tapes to C.I. Bill Fulton, who they claim destroyed them, leaving no copies or other means by which to satisfy the defense's discovery request. Reasonable inferences from these facts point to even more issues worth consideration. Had the prosecution complied with their constitutionally mandated discovery obligations, these issues and more would have been much more specifically and fully developed for both the defense and the public to make use of. In this way, Movement became a targeted Republican libertarian political activist by the Polar Pen strike force, attempting to build cases for prosecution, and U.S. Senator Ted Stevens, U.S. Congressman Don Young, Tea Party senatorial candidate Joe Miller, who nearly defeated moderate GOP Senator Lisa Murkowski, Victor Coring, Speaker of the Alaska House of Representatives, and Peter Cote, former state representative. All this was the work of AUSA's Nick Marsh and Joseph Bottini, with the same FBI agents and many of the same confidential informants who were and are tainted by Polar Pen. In fact, Movement was the last case developed and prosecuted well after FBI agent Chad Joy's complaint to OPR gained attention and caused the extensive investigation of Operation Polar Pen, leading to Senator Stevens' conviction being ultimately overturned. Once it became apparent that the misconduct would be made public, AUSA Joseph Bottini removed his and Marsh's names from Movement's case. The court was still under impression Bottini was trying the case. There's a blank page, but I'll skip that. Movement's case on the, this is written in, looks like somebody's made some notes in pencil. Movement's case on the first day of trial, the court was still under the impression Bottini was trying the case until on the first day of trial. This was a few weeks before the trial. Bottini withdrew and proceeded to sit right behind Mr. Scrocky and direct the prosecution, the gallery for it, remainder of the trial. Movement's arrest was just one day before the Ninth Circuit Court's opinion order in United States versus Coring 637 F.3D 895 211 US App Lexus 4763 on March 11, 2011. AUSA Marsh committed suicide shortly after learning that the Polar Pen team was going to be investigated by OPR. For the AUSA's directing the FBI agent controllers and confidential informants in Senator Stevens' case, U.S. versus Victor Coring's case, infra, in Peter Coates' case, 423 Fed, approximately 736-2011, U.S. Appropriate Lexus 6058. If impeaching and or exculpatory Brady Giglio Kyles materials were generated during those investigations, it was common practice that such evidence would be suppressed, concealed, deceptive fabrications used to prevent such evidence from use or disclosure, thus allowing known use of uncorrected perjury or false evidence to be used and even vouched for and bolstered by prosecutors. This misconduct has been found to be systematically permeate the work of this prosecution team by the Special Attorney Henry F. Schulke III, Esquire, appointed by this court in the Stevens case and is detailed in 686-page report issued thereafter. See in related special proceedings, USDC for the District of Columbia 842 F sub 2D 232 212 U.S. District Lexus 16656. Since Movement's case was developed during the same time and by the same Polar Pen prosecution, FBI agents, and some of the same confidential informant actors, the tactics used in regard to that Brady Giglio Kyles favorable evidence or impeachment evidence were the same: suppression, concealment, false statements, and the use of known perjured testimony are the hallmarks of this prosecution team in this present case. Evidently, once it was apparent that their investigative, prosecutorial, and police misconduct was being either investigated or publicly disclosed, subjecting said officials to sanctions, they doubled down. This case, which was primarily litigated after they were caught, contained more, not less egregious, willful, flagrant, bad faith misconduct, as it was then all the more important that said bad faith actions not come to light in Movement's case as well. Okay, there's another page 30 and another page 31, and it says the proper version of page 30 and 31 should be on Pacer. So there's an X mark through it, so I'm assuming we just read the proper version. Let's go on to page 32. It is this misconduct which brings Movement's case under the same Polar Pen investigation, and coupled with the evidence that suggests substantial Brady Giglio Kyles violations requires action by this honorable court. Movement was not charged with fraud, theft, robbery, tax evasion, or drug violations. He was charged with simple weapons possession offenses. Only after rejecting plea negotiations was he charged with a conditional future conspiracy to kill unknown federal officials. No acts of violence or attempted violence were proven or even alleged. The conviction was based on the prosecution's theory that someday when he's strong enough, Movement would commit a crime. Movement was not even arrested until he tried to flee the country with his wife and 2 young children after receiving death threat ultimatums from C.I. Bill Fulton. For over 2 years leading up to his arrest, Movement had refused the overture of undercover informants and had distanced himself from one agent provocateur after another until their efforts eventually escalated to express threats to kill him if he continued to refuse their advances. The government spent millions of dollars on failed attempts to induce Movement to plot a crime in the years leading up to his attempted departure and subsequent arrest. Movement has spent his entire net worth, over $400,000, defending himself from these charges. He has lost all he has, including his home, business, rental properties, and all other hard and liquid assets. His parents and extended family are also on the verge of bankruptcy from trying to help exonerate their son, brother, husband, and father. Movement unequivocally maintains his actual innocence in this case, especially with regard to the conspiracy charges or any intent to harm others. Movement is in dire need of Mr. Schulke's report to convince the Ninth Circuit of the egregious nature of the government's misconduct, and further to file a complaint to the DOJ's Office of Professional Responsibility and to confirm, if able, his allegations of Brady Giglio Kyles violations warranting dismissal of his convictions. Wherefore, based on the following allegations of suppression of favorable evidence and government misconduct by the Polar Pen strike force as described and asserted but not limited to below, to wit: number 1, the government's refusal to disclose Aaron Bennett's role as a CI when asked to, even though he had worked the case for over a year. The government's refusal to disclose Christopher Menino, who was their original undercover informant. Number 2, the government's refusal to turn over any 302's audio recordings or any other evidence generated by Bennett, though he was a key figure in the case and was even called as a witness by the defense. Number 3, the government's failure to properly supervise Bill Fulton, resulting in what apparently what was apparently an inappropriate sexual relationship between Fulton and his female FBI handler, Sandy Klein. Number 4, the government's redaction of text messages between Fulton and Agent Klein that evidence their sexual interaction. Number 5, the government misleading the district court as to the materiality and relevance of these sexually explicit messages between CI and handling agent. Number 6, the government's failure to properly supervise CI J.R. Olson, who has prior convictions for evidence tampering, by allowing him to switch his recording device on and off during interactions with the subject of investigation. Number 7, the government's refusal to officially disclose the type of recorder used and that it could be switched on or off, paused by the CHS CI while in the field. 8, the government's editing out exculpatory sections of audio recording and then copying the edited files into a different format so as to prevent the defense team's expert from identifying the digital seams forensically. Number 9, the government refusing to hand over the uncut original audio files when asked to. Number 10, the government misleading the district court as to the difference between the altered audio files and the defense team already had and the uncut originals in original format, and the government refused to hand over. Number 11, the government's failure to properly supervise CI J.R. Olson by allowing him to steal $30,000 worth of gold coins from Marty Cox on 2/19/11. Number 12, the government threatening to cause Marty Cox trouble if she pressed the police to look into the matter of the stolen gold. Number 13, the government's witness tampering by relaying facts about the real Schaeffer Cox that were not true or supported by evidence to several witnesses prior to their testimony. Number 14, the government's witness tampering by threatening the Fort Wainwright military police with legal realization if they testified for the defense. Number 15, the government's refusal to turn over the police reports from the movement reported the violent intentions of some members of the community who turned out to be CIs to Alaska State Trooper Rex Leith. Number 16, the government's refusal to turn over the police reports from when movement inquired of the Alaska State Trooper Barak about the federal agent wanting to kill Movement. Movement had been warned by the Fort Wainwright military police that federal agents had expressed an intent to shoot Movement when they got the opportunity in order to fix the Schaeffer Cox problem. Number 17, the failure of the government to properly supervise CI Bill Fulton by allowing him to actually physically attack Les Zerbe with a hunting knife because he and Movement refused to join him in plotting a crime, and then to hold the knife to Les Zerbe's throat while demanding that Movement agree to commit a crime. Movement and Mr. Zerbe still refused to agree, but after this assault, Movement was in fear for his life from Fulton. 18, the government's refusal to properly supervise Fulton by allowing him to make continued death threats against Movement in an effort to motivate Movement to plot a crime, such as the threat recorded on February the 5th, 2011. Number 19, the government's failure to properly supervise CI J.R. Olson by allowing him to remove the battery from Movement's vehicle and promise a ride from a fictitious trucker so as to leave the Movement stranded, thus preventing him from following through with his express plan to leave the country because of Movement's fear of Bill Fulton and out of desire to avoid any sort of trouble. Number 20, the government's bad faith deception of the jury by emphatically claiming in closing arguments that, I submit to you folks, you've got 5 hours of audio, okay? You try to find a statement anywhere about Bill Fulton's trying to kill me, Aaron Bennett's trying to kill me, you're not going to find it. You can look through all your documents if you want. You can go through all 900 of them. You're not going to find it. This after using deception, lies, and fraud upon the court to hide their own recorded evidence. 21, the government's misleading the trial court as to need for motions in limine that precluded questioning of the government's motive for bringing this case or informant J.R. Olson's gold theft and evidence tampering. Conclusion and prayer for relief. While being investigated and sanctioned for their egregious prosecutorial misconduct, AUSA's Joseph Bottini, Nicholas Marsh, and others working at their direction displayed utter contempt for this court and its leniency when, in addition to refusing to accept responsibility for their wrongdoing once they were caught, they managed to conceal the majority of their criminal acts from this court and from Mr. Schulke's investigation, thus allowing them to expand the scope of and severity of their habitual fraud and deceit in violation of Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 60B3 D3 fraud on the court. Their conduct can be likened to a bank robber who was let out on bail only to rob more banks, but instead of just stealing money, they were stealing people's lives and reputations and destroying families and depriving the voters of their right to free and fair elections. The reopening of this investigation is warranted because by fraud and deceit, Mr. Schulke was deprived of the information he needed to make an informed recommendation as to what corrective and or punitive action should be taken. And likewise, this court was deprived of information it needed to make just and equitable decisions. As a result, the polar pen misconduct is being allowed to continue. More crimes are being committed and additional parties are being harmed, including your movement. In light of this, your movement respectfully requests that this honorable court, 1, order the clerk of court to provide movement with a copy of Mr. Schulke's report with whatever provisos the court deems necessary. 2, reopen in related special proceedings after finding that movement has shown a reasonable probability that Joseph Bottini and others foisted fraud upon the court during the pendency of the previous litigation, foisted fraud on the court during the pendency of the previous investigation. 3, grant leave of court for movement to submit additional evidence as it is discovered and after reviewing Mr. Schulke's report and such other relief as the court finds needful. Respectfully submitted, Schaeffer Cox, Francis Schaeffer Cox, number 16179-006, USP Marion, P.O. Box 1000, Marion, Illinois 62959. In the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. Certificate of service and verification of facts. Comes now Francis Schaeffer Cox, being a natural citizen of the United States, over the age of majority and subject to penalty or perjury under 28 U.S.C. 1746 and as an incarcerated indigent. This looks like a restating of page 1 maybe. All right. This is devastating news for the enemy. The prosecutors, Karen Loeffler, Loretta Lynch, the Obama Department of Justice. We live in a very wicked world. Let me just close this down with a prayer. Dear God Almighty, Lord Jesus Christ, Lord, we pray that you guide us, give us direction. We pray that you help us, Lord, to expose the evildoers, to set our brother Francis Schaeffer Cox free. Give us whatever tools. Please intervene in this situation. Please expose with your bright light the wickedness that's been done in this situation, and we pray that justice may come to each and every individual who's foisted fraud and acted without regard to morality or ethics. Lord, we pray for your divine intervention in this situation. And in the precious and holy name of Jesus do we pray. Amen.